am so happy today to be joined by Viva Frei. Did I say it correctly?
Yep, it's Viva Frei, like half of my last name, Freiheit, which means freedom in German.
And your real name is David, of
Yeah.
course, but I will go with Viva Frei. So let's get started, obviously. You are a Canadian in a big way. You now live in America. Congratulations. You do a lot of good work with independent journalism. We've interviewed some of the same people, ironically, from Glenn Greenwald to Dave Rubin and great people like that. But for you, of course, how did you kind of get involved with, having a social media presence like that? Because obviously you were a litigator, if I'm correct, at a point. Uh,
I was a litigator up in Canada, and I had a YouTube channel since like 2013 or something, and then I discovered the world of viral videos back in 2014 with a video called "Squirrel Steals GoPro," which you may or may not have seen. And video went viral. Then I discovered you could make money by, licensing videos. And I stayed apolitical for a very long time because I was still a practicing lawyer and didn't want to mix anything with any. I just used it as an outlet for fun. And then eventually I started doing a little bit of like legal themed stuff, which people seem to like. And then I did this Alex Jones deposition analysis, which people really liked. And then I figured I'll niche into that because I'm still, a lawyer, got all this expertise. And then COVID hit, and then the world went off the deep end, and people need to understand what's going on around them.
the trucker convoy in Canada was something that you obviously had a big part in as well. At a
Yeah, and that was a total accident because I was in the States for some James O'Keefe event that he was putting on. And then everyone starts texting me like, Viva, why aren't you in Ottawa at this trucker protest? So I get right back to Canada the Monday after the Friday when the protest starts. I just drive up to Ottawa it's 2.5 hours from Montreal to document live stream what's going on. And if people are vandalizing and desecrating the war memorial, I'll document it in real time. Get down there and discover that, like we all knew for years before, media lies pathologically through its teeth. And that protest was the most amazing thing ever. And then I just started going back day after day, documenting, meeting people, and, being an inadvertent part of history.
And obviously, since we're on the topic of Canada, this is the perfect time for me to bring it up. Um, we got an election next week in Canada happening, a big one on the 28th, if I'm correct. Where do you kind of see that playing out right now? I know you've been saying some stuff about it, but for somebody who's maybe younger watching this on my channel, or older, where do you kind of see the election going?
I think it's going to be the most consequential election in Canadian history. Now, and I sincerely believe that the last election in America was the most consequential election in American history. The only difference is really like Canada on the world scale we can admit, has less of an impact than America. So the most consequential election for the biggest country, most powerful country on earth, is far more consequential than the most consequential election for Canada. But we're at the similar crossroads, and between censorship of a so-called liberal regime and freedom of speech. Fake news propaganda in Canada, state-funded media dictating narratives versus independent voices being heard. The institution versus the people. Corruption versus populism. We're at that crossroads in Canada, much in the same way we were in the States in 2020, but even more so in 2024. My major concern, Canadians are a little bit different than Americans in that they think what makes them good and better is not being American, and they think what being good and better means is being complacent to authority, being deferential to authority, being polite. And I put it in quotes because politeness, when it's subservience, quickly turns into anger and rage when other people are not equally subservient. Much like you can see now, if you haven't seen the memes of the middle fingers coming up in Canada, the so-called polite, peace-loving liberals are flipping the bird at everybody who they don't like. And so we're at that crossroads in Canada. We just don't have that same populist pushback from the people at large. Where my concern is that this freaking three passport carrying globalist stooge, Mark Carney, is going to sweep in, be anointed interim prime minister, and hoodwink all of Canada, or at least, enough to vote him into office that he's different than the last 10 years of liberal rule, even though he's been an integral advisor part of it for the last 5 years. So I'm concerned that Canada basically seals its own coffin right now by electing the Liberals for another 4 years after 10 years of liberal devastation.
which is something that's really interesting to me because obviously I had one point that interviewed Jean Charest. Um,
Jean Charest.
yeah, I said it wrong.
Oh yeah, no, it's good.
No. I would have been 16 at the time, so I think it was the day I got my driver's license after I interviewed him. But obviously at that time, a few months later, he ran against Pierre Poilievre, lost that one for the Conservative Party, so I'm familiar with that. But all the way back when he was deputy prime minister and Kim Campbell was in office for 4 or 5 months, if I'm correct, is that kind of what would similarly happen possibly with Carney? Because you mentioned I'd be the interim prime minister,
Yeah,
like.
well, the Carney, no one expected him to be a long-lasting or a long-serving prime minister. Justin Trudeau, in give him credit, they're evil, but they're not necessarily that stupid, or at least the institution is not that stupid. Trudeau had run the Liberal Party and Canada into the ground. 10 years. I'm not exaggerating. Everything is worse in Canada. Suicide is up, overdoses are up, crime is up, gun crime is up, homelessness is up, child hunger is up, euthanasia is up, taxes are up. Everything is worse. And after 10 years of this and spending the next two generations into deficit or into debt, and his scandals. I mean, one scandal after another. He had two ethics violations, which were confirmed. A third, which he's skated through by the skin of his teeth. The blackface scandal. What else? The groping a reporter scandal. He drove Canada and the Liberal Party into the ground, and then he resigns, announces a leadership race, prorogues Parliament, which means they suspend Parliament so it's no longer in session. Then they swoop in Mark Carney as the new face of the party. He ran against Karina Gould, scoundrel MP who saluted the Nazi and then tried to have that entire moment struck from the official parliamentary record, and Chrystia Freeland, who has been more loyal to Ukraine than she has been to Canada. So they swoop in this guy who's a new face to anybody who didn't know him, but who's not a new face whatsoever. He's been Trudeau's financial advisor, albeit informal, for the last 5 years. And if anybody has any doubts about it, go to the frickin' WEF website, and it's literally in his profile, on his bio, on his landing page, on the WEF, that he's been an advisor to Trudeau since 2020 and formally appointed some position in 2024. So they swoop this guy in. He's a nice looking old man, polite, talks softly, whatever. He annihilates the competition in the leadership race. And now people who are either, they have political amnesia or they never knew to forget in the first place, think this guy's a new face to the Liberal Party and he's going to somehow turn around the party and turn around the country. And I think it looks like they're going to give him a chance. So it is going to be devastating, disastrous, and emblematic of so-called conservative ineptitude if they blow this election. I'm mildly optimistic they won't, but we will know by this time next week, maybe.
Yeah, because obviously it can take a little longer for things to go there. Let's get into something else, though. Obviously, on the world stage, is where do you kind of see a lot of these conflicts going, especially with Ukraine and Russia, and then obviously Israel and Palestine, which really, I mean, that's an entire different sort of Middle East thing. But more specifically, I think Russia and Ukraine is the one where like we've heard kind of really nothing about lately.
It's isn't it amazing? Like the people who literally were front and center cover of Time magazine have fallen off the frickin' map. Joe Biden, Kamala Harris, Tim Walz, Vladimir Zelensky, they just disappeared off the face of the earth. Where do I see it going? It's going to go exactly where it was always going from 3 years ago, except 500,000 Ukrainians later. It's going to end with Russia exerting its force and taking the eastern region, the Donbass region. That's where it was always going to end. That's where it should have basically started because people don't seem to remember that Zelensky was elected on a platform of negotiating something of a resolution to the dispute of the eastern region. But set that aside, that's where it's going to end, whether people like it or not. And people can compare it to Hitler all they want. It's only because they're idiots that they do this. It was a regional conflict that would have never been exacerbated to the point that it's been exacerbated had it not been for foreign interference coming in and saying, no, we're going to use Ukraine and Ukrainian men and women as a proxy, as blood oil on this machine to fight Russia. It would have never gotten to where it's gotten today. So it's going to end where it probably would have ended regardless, but 3 years ago and however many hundreds of thousands of people later. Israel and Palestine, I mean, so you're very young. I'm not very old, but I've lived through two of these flare-ups. There was the Intifada, the first one and the second one. I forget what years exactly. I think one of them was 2021, give or take. And it's the same bloody cycle of violence, no pun intended, over and over again. A horrific terrorist incident, reprisals, people say collective punishment. It's the exact same cycle over and over again. Where does it end? I don't see this one ending any different than the other ones. People eventually, despite all of the pro, the supporters of Palestine, they eventually get tired and they forget and they move on. And then another flare up in 5, 10 years without any lasting solution, because ultimately the people who are fomenting this discord don't want a resolution. If they wanted a resolution to this, there would have been a resolution 2 decades ago. Everybody seems to like playing the Palestinian problem for their own political profit. That's where I see that going. Where do I see Canada going? Dude, we're going to find out whether or not Canada is going to become a vassal of China if it is not already a vassal of China. You got Chinese influence in Canadian Parliament going back to 2019. Chinese influence this time around, WeChat promoting narratives that are quasi pro Carney. And I mean, the whole Chinese infiltration in terms of buying up minerals, buying up mines, buying up land, Canadian government training Chinese soldiers on Canadian soil. I'm sure you know that.
Well, the
And
natural resources, that's a big one. Perry talked about that I mean, just so much. I mean, you guys got a lot of land.
yeah, we got a lot of land, a tenth of the population of, I mean, as much land as the States, I think a little bit more, and a tenth of the population, all of which lives, 70% of which lives within the border of America, within whatever, 50, 70 kilometers of the border of America. So we're going to find out. It's not that the conservatives are much better, but at the very least, it's not necessarily a balderdash in the same direction. Maybe it'll slow down. Maybe they'll have time to reverse course a little bit in terms of the destruction of Canada. But it's nuts. I mean, we've opened up our borders. Or I should say, we have opened up they have opened up the borders, but I'm still Canadian. 97% of population growth has been via immigration, 500,000 a year, people who don't share Canadian values, people who import foreign conflict. And now you're seeing the results of it. Protests on the street, areas of Canada which are they're speaking neither of the two official languages of Canada, and in some cases they're actually telling the Europeans to go home, that Canada is now home of the foreigners, many of whom are illegal because they've handed out these visas for student visas, and then they default on their classes, then they try to cross into the border in the States even though they're on terror watch lists. So we'll find out. It'll be the death nail if Carney manages to get elected. Everything that he's been using to buy off the votes now, they're going to reverse course once they get into power and finish the job, turn Canada into a satellite of China or a satellite of the globalist unit.
For sure. And one last thing on Canada, because I know you're a busy man, but where would you kind of say that obviously Trump kind of has trashed Pierre, Poilievre, but obviously maybe there's a strategy there because it makes people. Do you think there is a strategy behind that, or do you think that's just Trump being frustrated because of everything going on? And I mean, he's the leader of the free world. Where do you? That's just kind of my last thing I want to
Don't
ask.
worry, you can ask as many as you want to know. I've got my theory about that. I think Trump is genuinely befuddled at Pierre Poilievre's stupidity, because like, he would never have trashed Pierre had Pierre not acted like an idiot in response to the tariffs or the threat of tariffs. And so, my philosophy on this is that Trump views it as having given the layup to Pierre. He's like, here, Pierre, I'm going to impose some tariffs or threaten tariffs. And all you have to do is blame it on the liberals, blame it on, and rightly so. I mean, people think it's pretextual. It's not. There are like 8 times more people on terror watch lists trying to cross the border from Canada into the States than from Mexico into the States. Why? Because we've had an open border policy handing out visas to everybody and anybody from hostile nations, and then they try to get into the States. The fentanyl crisis in Canada is real. The fentanyl super labs are real. The fact that only allegedly 1% of what they nab is nabbed at the northern border, not in Mexico, probably has only to do with the fact that the Canadian-American border is not militarized. And so they're smuggling it in on train cars and it's not getting caught. The bottom line, do you know how many Canadians die a month on average from overdose? Like over 600 from overdose. 80% of that is related to fentanyl. We've got a problem. We've got super labs. It comes from China, and we have a China problem in Canada. And all Pierre had to do was say, we'll fix up the borders. We will fix up the drug problem. It's all the liberals doing that we have these tariffs or these threats of the tariffs. Bada bing, bada boom, he wins the election. And he doesn't have to take a pro-Trump position. He just doesn't have to take an anti-Trump position. He's gotten more anti-Trump, arguably, than Carney. It's almost like it was a competition, but he blew it. And Trump is not in. He's like, I gave you the layup, you fumbled the ball, and then you popped it and then walked off the field. Now I don't care. I'd rather have a globalist loser like Carney anyhow. He'll be easier to push around. So I mean, it wasn't Trump's tariffs that impacted the election. It was Poilievre's response to those tariffs, which was wholly deficient, and I would almost feel like sabotage, depending on who was giving him that advice from the beginning.
Wow. Well, I appreciate you sharing all this feedback today on Canada, your thoughts on Ukraine and Russia, your thoughts on the Israel conflict. One last thing I got to say is, what is so important to you when it comes to things like nature? Because I know you're a big person when it comes to nature. You love things like, uh,
Everything.
yeah,
Fishing. But I mean, I've now.
your most viral video is a squirrel video taking your camera, if I'm correct. So,
Yep.
what's something? This isn't even a political question. What's something that you just love about nature the most? Is it the sound?
Look, I love, there is scientific evidence as to the blue expanse of the ocean that is therapeutic. But I mean, anybody who doesn't love nature, I'm suspicious of. And people that you maybe don't like camping out in mosquitoes, but there's something therapeutic about nature. And the whole irony is conservatives, or who they would call conservatives, are generally nature people, and to accuse them of being climate denialists and whatever is idiotic. I mean, it's like I love spawning salmon, and we would want to do everything we can to ensure that the rivers and the estuaries remain open for salmon to spawn, so we can keep catching them. It doesn't mean that I buy into any of the crap that we're doing now, nor do I think that mining for rare earth minerals in African countries and devastating their environment is somehow better for the environment because we don't have to do it here. But no, I mean, nature is freaking amazing. And I've only recently just discovered, if you can't call it God-ish, godly, godlike life cycle of the caterpillar, it's blowing my mind. I mean, we got these monarchs growing in our backyard now. And if that doesn't make you not necessarily believe in God, but if it doesn't make you think that there might be some truth to a God creator, then nothing will. But nature is purely amazing.
Totally agree. And one last thing I just want to say on nature is, what's so crazy is, like, I would be categorized as a conservative leaning guy. Totally. I'm not, obviously far right, but I would be categorized as pretty conservative for a college campus. Now, that's not too hard to be. Um, but with that being said, I will oftentimes like see myself picking up, can of beer if I'm taking something out to the trash already that's in the parking lot when I'm walking from my apartment to the trash can, right? Doing something good like that. Not because I'm some like, we got to stop global warming, but just it's good to pick up a piece of trash. I'm already walking to the trash can. I've never really seen my liberal friends do that. And I'm not calling them hypocrites, but I have seen liberals and all those girls who probably voted for Kamala Harris coming out of frat parties throwing their beer cans everywhere. And who's the guy picking it up on the way to the trash? This guy who voted for Donald Trump right here, me.
No, the insanity of it, you won't call them hypocrites. I will. They're literally burning Teslas. I mean, the liberals in Canada are literally talking about 100% tariffs on green energies because they disagree with the politics of the individual. And who do they benefit with this? China, the biggest polluter on earth. So whether or not it's deliberate hypocrisy, it's practical hypocrisy. They claim to love certain things, and then yet they behave in a way that is totally contrary to what they purport to actually care about. So they're either hypocrites or they're just stupid. And I've been going very hard on the Liberals of Canada. They're either stupid, corrupt, or dependent on the states and have no choice but to vote Liberal. But that's a reality. It's not an exaggeration.
For sure. Well, I appreciate you joining the Jacob Buer show today, Viva Frei. And is there anything else you got to say?
No, I was wondering how many times do you get Buer, Buer, bada bing, bada boom? Have you seen?
The
You've
time.
seen
That's Ferris Bueller's Day
it.
Off. I've not watched it, but I've been told that since I was probably 8 or 9.
I have not watched it. I think it's aged a little bit, but it's worth watching. So, when you get a chance.
For sure. One last question I got to ask since we're on the topic of movies. What's your favorite movie?
At the risk of people judging me, I've got a top 10. Comedy is Happy Gilmore, Billy Madison, Dumb and Dumber. Drama or action is Die Hard 1, Face Off. Pulp Fiction, Train Spotting. Let me see what else I could watch every day of the week. Reservoir Dogs. Braveheart is one of the greatest movies ever made.
Quentin Tarantino fan all around.
Yeah, some of the stuff got a little
I
cliche.
took a class on him last semester here. He did not teach it, but I got to take a class for credit at Purdue, so that's a highlight of college.
That's amazing. No, that's great. And then I was just talking about Magnolia, Boogie Nights, and Royal Tenenbaums and Rushmore.
Wow. Well, I appreciated joining the show today, and it's going to be interesting to see what happens throughout this entire year with all the things we discussed today that are currently very mainstream. And I appreciate you coming on again.
My pleasure. Thank you.